It's especially delightful for me to be here under the auspices of the Lumen Christi Institute, which, as Tom mentioned, I spent quite a bit of time working with him in the early days to sort of bring into existence, and that, the things that I learned and the people that I met, and all the things I learned from Thomas, spending endless hours with him talking about everything, have been great treasures to me in my life. So I'm thrilled and grateful to be back speaking for the Lumen Christi Institute and speaking here at this university that I also spent quite a lot of time at and love. So as Thomas said, love tonight and fear tomorrow. And I want to thank all of you, of course, for coming out. There's always a wave of nostalgia walking up the stairs of Swift Hall for me, especially remembering Jean Bethke Elshtain, who some of you may have known, who was a very dear friend, a friend of the Lumen Christi Institute as well. And the loss of her presence here is a great loss to Lumen Christi, to the university, and personally to me. So I like to remember her at the outset here. When Thomas asked me whether I'd like to come give a talk on Rougemont's Love in the Western World, I said, why not? And if that were anything more than a rhetorical question, it would be actually pretty easy to answer, because to expound and to judge the merits of Rougemont's argument really requires extensive knowledge in about a dozen areas that I don't really have. I'm particularly grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Medieval Studies workshop, and particularly if there are medievalists here tonight who know a lot more about this period than I do. I'm very glad to have you to enlighten us on some points that we may want to pursue. The reason I'm interested in Rougemont, aside from the fact that reading him for the first time many years ago in college really reconfigured my mental landscape, is that I think he makes an important contribution to recognizing some basic features of modern Western culture that are hard to recognize for what they are from the inside. I would describe these basic features under the broad description of Gnosticism, which, very roughly, is the belief that the world as we know it is not good, and something has to be done about it. And various thinkers have explored this theme, this topic of Gnosticism in modernity, or the way Gnosticism manifests itself in the modern world. For example, in the area of our political ideals and aspirations, the Gnostic pattern was identified and examined above all by a political philosopher by the name of Eric Voegelin. And in our relationship to nature, in its economic and scientific and technological dimensions, some of the observations I found most illuminating come from a theologian named Joseph Ratzinger, better known as Pope Benedict. But in the dimension of erotics, that is, the dimension of our desires and fantasies and dramatic literary imagination, as they shape what we wish for in our most intimate human relationships, as well as what we seek from life itself, I've found Rougemont to be a helpful guide, and particularly revisiting Rougemont after all these years and realizing that he's much more complicated than I remembered. Denis de Rougemont's 1939 book, L'amour et l'Occident, Love in the Western World, known in British versions as Passion and Society, presents roughly the following thesis. The literary tradition of the West that shapes how we think and feel about love has its roots in a heretical form of Christianity, so that we would not experience love as we do or think and talk about it as we do, were it not that our culture has been formed by a struggle between Christian orthodoxy and Gnostic heresy. The book begins with a fascinating analysis of the myth of Tristan and Isolde, in which Rougemont sees the clearest prototype of subsequent European literary treatments of love, and especially in the novel. For the sake of describing the content of the book, though, I think it's better to start with the Provençal troubadour poetry, which inspires the chivalric romances. It's widely recognized that the troubadours of 12th century Languedoc initiate the tradition of European love poetry. Rougemont's controversial historical thesis is that the poetry of the troubadours gives expression to the Albigensian heresy, the secret religion of those known as the Cathars, which existed at the same time and in the same geographical area as the troubadours, and generally among the very same aristocratic families who supported the poets. So the general structure of the story becomes clearer, I think, if we start with the troubadours and the Cathars, and then look backward along the history of religions and forward along the history of European literature. And so you see why there's much more here than I can have sufficient knowledge of to really do justice to it. The Provençal word troubadour, like the Greek word poietes, means a maker or a composer. And what the troubadour typically makes is a song, usually 40, 50 lines or so. Scholars have identified, differentiated about 20 genres of troubadour song, including satires and crusade propaganda. But most of them dealt with love, and above all, with the anguish of unsatisfied love. As an example, consider this partial stanza from the troubadour Geoffrey Rudel. Love of a distant land, for your sake all my heart aches, and I cannot find a remedy to the ill of lacking sweet love. The usual pattern is that the poet loves a noble lady and sings of her perfections. But something prevents the satisfaction of that love. It might be her refusal, or her inaccessibility because of rank, or because she's just watched over, or because she dwells so far away. Rudel is rumored to have loved the Princess of Tripoli, whom he had never seen. But in any case, or in most cases, she's inaccessible because she's married. It's also rumored that at the end of his life, the poet went to seek the Princess of Tripoli and died in her arms. And in fact, the poet's misery in troubadour song often leads him to wish for release in death, which would be preferable to his suffering. As Rougemont observes, it's the intensity of the passion and its effects that animate this poetry. Poetry which is of just the right length to speak of a passion and unfold its dimensions. Without the obstacles to its satisfaction, the passion would never reach its necessary intensity. Thus, the animating heart of the poem is the obstruction of love, which heightens the intensity and anguish of the passion. The subject of the poem is not, in fact, the perfect and beautiful lady, but rather the longing for deliverance from the anguish of heightened passion, which love of the beautiful lady has occasioned. The poem, then, is both a celebration and a lament of passion itself. Rougemont turns to the troubadour poetry precisely because it is this constitutive obstruction of passion that catches his attention in the myth of Tristan and Isolde. The knight and queen who fall passionately in love, but are repeatedly separated by the most contrived obstacles. Rougemont reflects, whence arises this preference for whatever thwarts passion, hinders the lover's happiness, and parts and torments them. The events narrated are but images or projections of a longing, and of whatever runs counter to this longing, excites it, or merely protracts it, What then is the legend really about? The partings of the lovers? Yes, but in the name of passion, and for love of the very love that agitates them, in order that this love may be intensified and transfigured at the cost of their happiness and even of their lives. This passion, which runs athwart the institution of marriage, which transports the lovers into another rarefied world of their own, and which finds release from its torment in death, is Rougemont's clue to the connection between troubadour poetry and the religious mysticism of the Cathars. The Albigensian Cathars, whose name comes from the Greek katharoi, meaning the pure or the purged, belong to the broad stream of Gnostic Christianity, like the Manichaeans with whom the young Augustine became entangled. And some historians trace a lineage from the Manichaeans to the Albigensians through the Bogomils of the Balkan region. All of these groups were dualists, believing in some variant or another that the good God made a purely spiritual creation that then became entangled in the material bodily world created by the bad God or demiurge. Purification requires denial of the body and its satisfactions, a gathering of the pure spiritual energies so as to rise above and overcome entrapment in the flesh. These beliefs usually dictate, among other things, pacifism, vegetarianism, and celibacy. And sexual abstinence is especially important, both psychologically, so as to keep one's Eros pointed beyond the world to one's true life as pure spirit, and also ethically, so as not to generate more bodies and thus entrap more spirits in earthly life. This is the reason for the Cathars' opposition to the marriage and procreation preached and legitimated by the Catholic Church, particularly vigorously at this time. Thus, for the Cathars, this earthly existence, which presents itself as a world of daylight, is really the realm of darkness, which blinds us to our true spiritual essence. And the death that deluded mortals imagine as the final darkness is really an entry into the light of the true life, to which our Maker calls us out of the world. The Maker who is pure light, and with whose pure light we are consubstantial and destined to be reunited if we can transcend our prison of flesh. The inaccessible lady celebrated by the troubadours thus represents the purity of the beloved light that cannot be enjoyed in this life, and whose distance from us makes us ache with longing for deliverance. The Gnostic rejection of the body is mirrored in the obstacles that prevent bodily satisfaction of the troubadour poet's love. And the suffering of that chaste love is the salutary discipline, or ascesis, that purifies through pain, rendering the devotee worthy of the beloved. The deliverance of death is the ultimate liberation from the turmoil and torment of bodily, passionate life. Thus, according to Rougemont, it is a Gnostic heresy which rejected procreative marriage that taught European literature its rhetoric of passion, and ultimately led to the peculiarly Western cultural phenomenon of sexual liberation, so that at its origins, that liberation was a liberation from the delusional love of life. In other words, the secret love conveyed by the literature that celebrates the transports of passion is none other than the love of death. A quick glance toward the latter end of this literary tradition helps both to confirm Rougemont's thesis and to reveal the dynamic of what he calls a gradual secularization or profanation of the religious myth. In Emma Thompson's brilliant 1995 film adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, Marianne, the second Dashwood sister, represents the tradition of romantic love about which Rougemont writes. Marianne says to her mother, To love is to burn, to be on fire like Juliet or Guinevere or Eloise. To which her mother quite sensibly responds, as a mother would, "They made rather pathetic ends, dear." Marianne in turn objects, "Pathetic? To die for love? How can you say so? What could be more glorious?" A bit lurid for Jane Austen. It's not in the original. But it's a good addition. A glorious death. In most of the world's history, a glorious death would be one that occurs in battle as a sacrifice on behalf of life. The life of one's city, one's family, one's comrades. But of course, there's always an ambiguity in this glorious death, since it's also a testimony to one's own willingness to rise above one's own fear and one's own attachment to life. Thus, protecting life may merely be serving as the occasion for throwing away life to prove one's own nobility. In dying for passionate love, the ambiguity is abated, is sublimated into a more harmonious illusion, you might say. The lover's death proves his or her worthiness of the beloved. The harmony consists in reducing the question entirely to one of worthiness, proven through suffering and death. The illusion consists in the hypnotic image of the beloved, who really has nothing to do with the reason for the sacrifice, but only serves as its occasion. The beloved, in a certain sense, is not a real person, but an idol to whom one willingly sacrifices oneself so as to prove one's worthiness. In Catharist dualism, the original heretical religion, the relationship of sign and signifier is at least clear. Greatness of passion is celebrated precisely because it betokens the rejection of mere life and the love of death, or the true life. Troubadour poetry obscures that relationship, as if the embrace of death were the sign, and the greatness of passion the thing signified by it. By means of this obscurity, it dissimulates its character as the expression of a distinct religious vision, one emphasizing human alienation from the given world. And this is the general shape of the story that Rougemont tells about the development of modern Western literature. This literary tradition begins in a religious metaphysics that rejects life and celebrates overwhelming passion, a passion that raises us above life's common concerns and launches us towards death. But as the tradition develops, shaped by the rhetoric of passion, it increasingly obscures the true object of its worship, so that the heterodox religious dimension that animates it becomes increasingly obscured. So, a brief look at how some of that history unfolds. From the troubadours, there issue forth two streams, mainly. One stream begins with tales of chivalric romance, and I'll come back to that. And as this stream develops, it spreads an increasingly secularized, or profaned, in Rougemont's word, version of Gnosticism into the European imagination and its rhetoric of passions. The other stream tries to bring courtly rhetoric's celebration of love and beauty back into the channel of the Catholic orthodoxy of the day. This orthodox stream runs primarily through such mystical authors as Bernard of Clairvaux, Francis of Assisi, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross. Probably its greatest literary representative is Dante's Divine Comedy, though it seems to have taken Dante his whole poetic career to overcome the power of the religion of courtly love, whose rhetoric still dominates the early Vita Nuova. And some people would argue he never overcame it, but I think he did. What the Orthodox Catholic tradition revolves around in this regard is the doctrine of the Incarnation and its revelation of divine love as agape. What the heretical tradition revolves around is pure pagan Eros, which is to say boundless desire, a longing that reaches beyond all limited satisfactions, dissolving those limits so as to arrive at absolute unity without differentiation and reabsorption into the all. According to Rougemont, absolute unity must be the negation of the present human being in his suffering multiplicity. It is infinite transcendence, man's rise into his God. What Jean-Luc Marion very nicely describes as the form of idolatry and the beginning of God without being. And this rise is without return. Individual beings were but so many defects and eclipsings of the one and only being, and as such, none was susceptible of being really loved. By contrast, the incarnation, death, and resurrection makes, quote, dying to self the beginning of a new life already here below. Not the soul's flight out of the world, but its return in force into the midst of the world. And thus, agape, as exemplified by the incarnate God, grants all the dignity of being to our neighbor, and in a certain sense may be said even to bring our neighbor into being. As Rougemont says, the symbol of love is no longer the infinite passion of a soul in quest of light, but the marriage of Christ and the church. And in this way, human love itself has been transformed. Whereas, according to the doctrines of mystical paganism, human love was sublimated so thoroughly as to be made into a god, even while it was being dedicated to death, Christianity has restored human love to its proper status, and in this status has hallowed it by means of marriage. In short, as he also puts it, passionate love wants the faraway princess, whereas Christian love wants our neighbor. Now, having waded into numerous quotes from de Rougemont's text, I think I can hardly do better at this point than to just quote at length a very long passage, Rougemont's description of the resulting situation that we have inherited from medieval Europe. The Middle Ages had two rival moral systems, one upheld by Christianized society, the other the product of heretical courtesy. The first took marriage for granted and even made it into a sacrament. The second promoted a set of values in the light of which, at any rate theoretically, marriage was a mistake. The attitude of each to adultery clearly indicates their mutual antagonism. In the eyes of the Church, adultery was at one and the same time a sacrilege, a crime against the natural order, and a crime against the social order. Whoever broke the triple undertaking given at the altar did not thereby become interesting, but an object of pity or contempt. The heresy, which was bound up from the beginning with the courtesia of the south of France, condemned Catholic marriage on each of the three heads just mentioned. But the mainspring of its triple rejection of marriage was, in reality, a doctrine according to which love is the divinizing Eros, everlastingly in anxious conflict with the fleshly creature and this creature's enslaving instincts. Accordingly, the appearance of the passion of love was bound radically to transform the attitude to adultery. Tristan was, no doubt, guilty of a fault in committing adultery, but at the same time, the fault took on the aspect of a splendid experience, more magnificent than morality. Its seductive power was intensified by the reader's own ignorance of the mystical significance of its symbols. Only thus can we account for the fact that in the 12th century, an adulterer or adulteress suddenly became somebody interesting. Continuing this long quote, what had hitherto been a fault and what could only give rise to edifying remarks on the perils of sin and on remorse now became, in symbol, something mystically virtuous, and later on was degraded in literature into a disturbing and alluring entanglement. In my opinion, Rougemont concludes, the present general breakdown of marriage reflects a confused strife in our lives as a result of the coexistence of two moral systems. One, inherited from religious orthodoxy, but no longer sustained by a living faith. The other, derived from a heresy of which the in essence lyrical expression has come down to us in a form altogether profaned and therefore distorted. Passion and marriage are essentially irreconcilable. Their origins and their ends make them mutually exclusive. Their coexistence in our midst constantly raises insoluble problems. Now, that drastic opposition will be qualified at the end of the lecture from Rougemont's own mouth. But he's engaging in the typical French talent of clarifying by drastic oppositions. As we've seen, the adulterous passion was a typical feature of troubadour rhetoric, the passion for the married lady. This both established the adulterous character of the passion, established the lady as, in principle, inaccessible, and positioned the lover implicitly in an existential opposition to the institution of marriage, without having to transgress it in action. In fact, it was essential, both for sustaining the passion and for fidelity to the heresy, that the lover never actually commit adultery. According to some historical traditions, it was Eleanor of Aquitaine who, in her successive royal marriages, brought her troubadours to the courts of Paris and then England, where they encountered Celtic legends and gave birth to tales of chivalric romance. When the courtly rhetoric gives shape to myths, drawing upon the Celtic materials, adultery becomes a plot device in those myths. As Rougemont remarks, myth arises whenever it becomes dangerous or impossible to speak plainly about certain social or religious matters or affective relations, and yet there is a desire to preserve these. The device of adultery served this rhetorical situation perfectly. The poet could agree with orthodoxy in disapproving of adultery and prove his bona fides by punishing it in his tale. But the divine law that inflicts the punishment is ambiguous. Seen from the side of orthodoxy, it's the law that sanctifies marriage and punishes its violation. Seen from the side of heresy, it's the law that confines passion to the role of elevating the soul and prohibits its impure bodily consummation. Both in the archetypal Tristan and Isolde myth and in the ever-popular romance of Lancelot and Guinevere, fatal and irresistible passion leads the knight to actually commit adultery with his lord's queen, an act eventuating in immense suffering and pathetic deaths. In Malory's 15th century version of the Grail quest, it's precisely Lancelot's sexual sin that prevents him from looking upon the Grail, while the virginal knights Galahad and Percival are permitted to achieve the quest because of their purity. This preeminent emphasis on sexual purity as the mark of the virtuous soul is much more characteristic of the courtly mythos than of Orthodox Catholic literature. In Dante's comedy, lust, while undoubtedly sinful, is among the least serious sins, presumably in part because the sexual passion is the most natural of passions. Courtly romance adopts the anti-natural standard of Gnostic heresy. But aside from the symbolic and rhetorical convenience of adultery for communicating tacitly the judgments of heterodoxy, it also intrinsically expresses the character of the Eros that Gnosticism harnesses and directs. Eros is hyperbolic. It is restless It chafes against all boundaries and limitations. Adultery expresses this rebellion against boundaries, which, according to the ancient Platonic tradition, propels our desire beyond the world of the sensible and ephemeral toward the ultimate and eternal. Because these transcendent and transgressing tendencies of Eros later came increasingly into conflict with the moderate and calculating spirit of an increasingly bourgeois European society, a society charmed by Enlightenment rationalism and its purported restriction of human thought to the sensible and immediate and self-interested, adulterous passion could increasingly present itself, understand itself, misunderstand itself, as an antidote to the confining limits of bourgeois respectability. And because its powerful expression in courtly literature harkened back to the proud follies and high sense of honor of a still vigorous aristocracy continually vanishing, it became easy to believe that the appeal to irresistible passion and the glamour of adultery operated through a secular literary imagination on a historical and sociological plane rather than on a religious and metaphysical one. Romantic literature, removed from the context of the clash between heterodox and orthodox arguments over the religious value of marriage, became fuel for the fantasies of rebellious bohemian aestheticism. Finally, Rougemont observes, in German Romanticism, the Western mind set out again on the venture previously undertaken by the unitive mystics. It adopted the old heresy of passion and sought to achieve the ideal transgression of all limitations and the negation of the world through extreme desire. On every side, the scattered components of the myth reappeared and came together ready for Wagner, who, in fashioning them into a final synthesis, was the one and only poet who dared exhibit the myth for what it is, namely, a lyrical hymn to the love of death and its resolution of all earthly discord. In the marvelous opera Tristan and Isolde. Now, to capture this trajectory that Rougemont describes, I'd like to talk for a little bit about a novel that I'm almost sure he had not read. Kate Chopin's The Awakening, published in 1899, which got such a hostile critical reception that it kind of vanished from people's awareness until the 1960s, more or less. But I think it captures remarkably well this trajectory Rougemont describes with a very lucid self-consciousness. The protagonist, Edna Pontellier, came originally from rural Protestant Southern gentry, and her adolescent amorous fantasies fixed first upon a cavalry officer and then on a famous tragic actor whose photograph she would kiss, before she ended up marrying a Creole banker and moved to New Orleans. A daring night swim in the immensity of the Gulf of Mexico prepares her to be moved by the romantic music of Chopin, the composer, to begin to recognize her passion for young Robert, the son of the owner of the island resort hotel where she's staying with her family. Robert leaves to seek his fortune in Mexico, and Edna returns to bourgeois family life in town, but she ceases to be able to conform to its expectations. Right, so we have the story operating on the level of the sociological rebellion. She seeks out the pianist from the resort, who shares with Edna her rather elevated ideals of art and passion, and plays Chopin, Beethoven, and Wagner for her. When her husband and children are away on a trip, Edna moves out of their house, takes up painting that she had abandoned, and has an adulterous dalliance. Before her final break with her husband, she throws an elegant and festive dinner party in their lovely house for her friends, a party full of light and color. But as she sat there amid her guests, she felt the old ennui overtaking her. The hopelessness which so often assailed her, which came upon her like an obsession, like something extraneous, independent of volition. It was something which announced itself, a chill breath that seemed to issue from some vast cavern wherein discords wailed. There came over her the acute longing which always summoned into her spiritual vision the presence of the beloved one, overpowering her at once with a sense of the unattainable. The presence of the beloved one suggests, but does not specify, the distant Robert, who soon returns from Mexico and visits Edna. But Robert is too decent to press upon her the love that he in fact feels for her, and thus fails to fulfill her fantasies that he would declare his love and embrace her the moment they were reunited. She had been with him, had heard his voice and touched his hand, but some way he had seemed nearer to her off there in Mexico. When they finally meet again and discuss openly their love, she tells him, "I love you, only you, no one but you. It was you who awoke me last summer out of a lifelong stupid dream. Oh, I have suffered. Now you are here. We shall love each other, my Robert. We shall be everything to each other. Nothing else in the world is of any consequence." Before Robert can answer one way or the other, Edna responds to the call she promised to answer to assist her friend, Madame Ratignolle, who is giving birth. After an earlier visit to the Ratignolles' bustling family home, Edna had felt depressed. The little glimpse of domestic harmony which had been offered her gave her no regret, no longing. She was moved by a kind of commiseration for Madame Ratignolle, a pity for that colorless existence which never uplifted its possessor beyond the region of blind contentment, in which no moment of anguish ever visited her soul, in which she would never have the taste of life's delirium. Edna vaguely wondered what she meant by life's delirium. Now, returning to the house and attending at the birth, Edna recalls her own almost disembodied experiences of childbirth. She recalled faintly an ecstasy of pain, the heavy odor of chloroform, a stupor which had deadened sensation, and an awakening to find a little new life to which she had given being, added to the great unnumbered multitude of souls that come and go. But Madame Ratignolle, the motherly woman, endures the bodily agonies of the visceral birthing experience, fully present to her body giving birth. Edna was not really needed and wanted to leave, but she did not go. With an inward agony, with a flaming, outspoken revolt against the ways of nature, she witnessed the scene of torture. Edna returns from the horrifying ordeal of fecundity to find a note from Robert that reads, "I love you. Goodbye, because I love you." She sinks to the sofa and spends the whole night in a stunned and silent vigil. Despondency had come upon her there in the wakeful night and had never lifted. There was no one thing in the world that she desired. There was no human being she wanted near her except Robert, and she even realized that the day would come when he too, and the thought of him, would melt out of her existence, leaving her alone. The children appeared before her like antagonists who had overcome her, who had overpowered and sought to drag her into the soul's slavery for the rest of her days. But she knew a way to elude them. Edna returns to the sea, whose terrifying power had awakened her, She swims out until her strength fails. One of the last things to flash through her imagination is the clang of the cavalry officer's spurs as he walked across the porch of her childhood home. Edna's awakening to sensuality and passion, to reclaiming her individuality as a desiring being, is only the beginning of a trajectory traced out by the German Gnostic philosopher Schopenhauer, whom Kate Chopin knew his writings. A path toward the realization of the way in which desire generates images of satisfying objects that attach us to the wheel of longing and suffering, and give us the illusion of the self as a unified center of willing and desiring, whereas in truth, according to Schopenhauer, all is one, and we can only attain rest when we are absorbed back into the oceanic all. And music is one of the most direct expressions of this underlying will that generates illusions of particularity in visual images, especially visual art. Whether Kate Chopin ultimately affirmed this Schopenhauerian vision or not, her one major artistic statement recognizes it as the ultimate truth of Romanticism and of the destiny of the soul that attains self-consciousness of the consequences of the empire of passion. But anyone familiar with St. Augustine's reflections on infinite desire will recognize at once that this Schopenhauerian vision is just Augustine's vision with God bracketed out. It is, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, revised to, our hearts are restless until they rest in nothingness. And the Augustinian vision is, in turn, a Christian articulation of the Platonic vision, in which the hyperbolic tendency of Eros is met by the hyperbolic excess of an object that cannot be limited and therefore can't really be an object, namely the good beyond being, as he calls it in Book 6 of the Republic. The whole tradition gradually constituted by the metaphysical reflection of Plato and Aristotle on goodness as a principle of being, and its theological articulation in Christian thought as the goodness of creation, reflecting the goodness of the Creator, stands in opposition to the Gnostic denial of the goodness of creation, its condemnation of nature and the body as the prison of souls. Because the Creator affirms the goodness of created beings, of bodily existence and life and fecundity, he also sanctifies marriage as a site for sharing in his self-giving love, which is why the Gnostic heretics always rejected Genesis as scripture. For the Christian, as Rougemont suggests in his conclusion, on the one hand, marriage and passion are at odds, as we've seen, since in marriage the spouses are making a pledge to one another that demands fidelity, whether the consequences turn out happy or unhappy, whether passion continues to animate their love or not. Fidelity is distinguished from passion by its persistent refusal to submit to its own dream, by its persistent need of acting in behalf of the beloved, by its persistently being in contact with a reality it does not attempt to flee. But at the same time, and here's the promised semi-resolution, the obstacle which nurtures all passion can be reborn within marriage. If it is true that passion seeks the inaccessible, and if it is true that the other as such remains the best defended mystery in the eyes of demanding love, could Eros and Agape not join in a paradoxical alliance at the very heart of a fully accepted marriage? The mystery of God as agape and as a person to be loved underwrites the mystery of the human person as capable of loving and being loved. Last page. The error of the Gnostics, then, lies not in the excess of their passion for transcendence, but rather in their inability to treat God as truly transcendent. A creator, to be really a creator, must be so transcendent of the limitations of the created order as to be not confined merely to transcendence, in opposition to and exclusion from eminence. He must be so transcendent as to be also fully immanent, present to everything. Hyperbolic Eros, stretching all the way to the Creator, is brought round again by way of the Creator's gift of being, or agape, back to the created being, who is loved in all his or her particularity. For the Gnostics, no created finite being is good, but only at best useful as a launching pad beyond itself on the lover's own journey to the ultimate unity. I conclude then that Nietzsche, in the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, got the diagnosis exactly backward. It's not the Platonic and Christian affirmation of the good that brings about otherworldliness and nihilism. Rather, the heretical Gnostic denial that being is good, the denial that goodness is a constitutive principle of being and therefore being is lovable, that is the precise definition of nihilism. This denial of the convertibility of being and goodness, to use the old scholastic language, is the implicit horizon within which all modern thought, all distinctly modern thought, including Nietzsche's, works its way to its conclusions. I would suggest that a better diagnosis of the phenomenon of nihilism, a diagnosis that allows us to see it from outside the modern horizon that generates it, comes from the text on the divine names by the Christian Platonist Pseudo-Dionysius. Given that the good transcends everything, as indeed it does, its nature, unconfined by form, is the creator of all form. In it is non-being really an excess of being. And one might even say that non-being itself longs for the good which is above all being. Repelling being, it struggles to find rest in the good which transcends all being, in the sense of a denial of all things. Now that's a little obscure, but I think this is Dostoevsky's understanding of what nihilism really means. But that's another story. Our Eros is directed toward and can only be satisfied by loving the good. If we evacuate beings of goodness, we will be impelled to seek the good only beyond them. And if we go further and fail to realize that the good is what we seek, we become trapped within endless negation as the only way to lay claim to our transcendence of finite and given being. The quest to satisfy our Eros in this way merges into the same project of negative transcendence that drives our technological domination of nature. And marriage, as the communion in the goodness of being, life, and natural fecundity, can only be the enemy of our frenzy to transgress and transcend all limiting conditions. Thank you.